In this video, we continue to explore our quality control here at April. Welcome back to another episode of Coffee with April. This time we're going to give you, as promised, part 2 of our roasting and quality control of our latest Kenyan coffee, Kamwangi. Now, for those of you that don't know, just some brief information about the coffee. It comes from Kenyan in Kenya. Kamwangi is one of the more established processing stations. Today they have almost 1,000 members. We've been working with it a few times before here at April, and we're really excited to actually bring it back again. Now, please, if you haven't watched the first video about this, do that for context, where we show you more details about the actual roasting. This part is going to be about the quality control of the coffee. Now, that breaks into 2 different parts, which is basically 1, sensory, which for us is basically cupping and brewing, and 2, a bunch of different measurements. Now, you can measure coffee with a bunch of different tools, and that's going to give you slightly different readings depending on what tools you do. But we have right now, and again, not a sponsorship or related to this brand in any other way, but we're currently using Lightels when we do measurements. And that goes for basically at the moment green coffee and then roasted coffee as well. Now, what we want to do is just to walk you through the measurements here, also walk you through the taste of the coffee, right? So we find more and more that these 2 are obviously really important, but doesn't always necessarily link together perfectly. So again, if you go back, you watch the first video, you see that we have 2 very interesting different profiles here, where the main difference of roasting the same coffee is the energy distribution before crack. So after crack, we've roasted these coffees more or less identical, and you're going to be able to see some numbers on that as well. What we have done in the beginning of the roast is starting one roast with what some people refer to as soak, so a lower burner setting, dropped in on the same temperature, I should say. With the other roast is basically starting with 100% burner all the way up until crack. After crack, we have dealt basically equally with both of these coffees. So this is really interesting when it comes to measurements. Before we jump into that, we're going to tell you a bit about the green coffee measurements. So here we've been focusing on basically moisture and density, which is the 2 most common measurements. We also, of course, have water activity as well, which we actually haven't measured at this point. Now, the moisture level in the coffee is 10.4, and the density here is 757 grams per liter. What it comes down to here, and what kind of gets interesting when we're talking specialty coffee, is that the more you measure, the more you realize that almost with some variation, most of the coffee processed in a proper way is going to come out having very similar measurements. So when we argue that certain coffees has extremely different density or different moisture, that's usually not true unless you basically pivot outside of specialty coffee. So basically taking a high-class specialty coffee Arabica versus a low-class or versus a Robusta or something else. In extreme cases, that could be a difference, but quite often we find very, very similar numbers, which is interesting then when people ask us, how do you use these coffees in terms of deciding how to roast? And the answer there is that we actually don't use them that much to decide how to roast. We basically use them to decide whether we should roast this coffee or not to begin with. So if the moisture content, for example, is above 12, or even to some cases in our world above 11 or below 10, we would probably not take it into a roaster and actually roast it. That goes without saying that it correlates also in different measurements when it comes to density in roasted coffee as well, right? Now, of course, density will differ depending on origin, depending on varietal to some degree. But again, the more you measure, the more you're going to find that the coffees actually fall into the same spectrum. We're probably going to do a part 3 of this where we dive into water activity as well, because I know that's something important. I know you guys want to see those numbers. We unfortunately don't have it on the specific coffee, but because we don't have that tool right here today. Usually we do. Now, that being said, again, a properly stored and processed coffee is going to have a very continuous moisture content as well, but more about that in another video. Now, what it comes down to now, and what is really interesting, is the measurements of the roasted coffee. So here we measure basically color on the inside and on the outside. And color is a great indication of color. that's basically about it. So we argue here that it's not such a good indicator in terms of taste. Obviously, you can burn the coffee and it's going to be quite dark, or you can severely under roast the coffee and it will be quite light. But in between there is a very wide radius that's going to basically indicate your coffee tasting differently for a bunch of different variables. One, which for example is grind size. So when you measure the inner color, the grind size you're using, basically the grinder you're using, is going to have a huge impact on which number you're actually going to get when you're reading on it. So for point of reference in this video, we're grinding on our cupping setting on an EK43. Now, for those of you that are familiar with the EK43 knows that you're not going to have a burr alignment that is the same on any given grinder, basically, which means that if you take our coffee and you take 5 different EKs on the same setting, same roast, you're gonna have slightly different numbers, right? Secondly, the time after roast, we're counting hours, days here, is gonna actually change the color reading as well. So when you take a color reading, you need to be consistent in terms of time after roast. So all of this naturally is going to differ quite a lot. On these 2 batches specifically, which is good for reference, we have obviously numbers. And the inside here is 90.5 on batch number 1. Batch number 1 is basically the batch we soaked in the beginning. Now, what's interesting here is that batch number 2 with full burner from the start has 90.7. which actually indicates that we have a very, very similar inner color here with 2 vastly different profiles. We should reference that batch number 1 is actually almost 1 minute longer than batch number 2. Now, for reference on the outer side of the beans, we're talking here 67 on batch number 1 and 68.6 on batch number 2. Also very, very similar. So it goes without saying here that what happens after first crack is going to be the determined factor for color readings. That's very, very clear, and that is nothing new. We've known this for a very long time. But the interesting thing here is that when we connect sensory, is that they're actually tasting quite different. So batch number 1 is a lot more balanced, a lot juicier in character. It's not as flavor intense, but it's a lot more flavor complex. And keep in mind now, this is the exact same coffee. Whereas batch number 2 is more flavor intense, has a higher vibrancy, but it's actually quite sour, right? So this becomes really interesting because the numbers in terms of color tracking doesn't tell us this, right? This is something that you can only link by sensory. So our approach to measuring color, measuring green coffee, is that it's something you should do and keep on doing it, but keep in mind that numbers, first of all, one is internal. As we talked about already, the color you're gonna get is very much depending on how you make the measurement. So it's very hard to reference your color with someone else's, right? Plus, you can't ship your coffee to someone else's because they're not gonna measure it the same day, therefore they get a different reading, right? So keep in mind that in the end of the day, we see this with brewing as well, and we're gonna come back to that also, is that technology is great, and we need to try to understand what we do better. But in the end of the day, let sensory guide you above all, right? That's the most important function when it comes to evaluating whether your coffee is good or not. So we find taste quality first and use numbers to guide us to be able to reproduce that taste quality. Now, that was basically all we had for now. Just a bit of details in terms of how we do quality here at April, part 2, watch part 1. As always, if you have any questions, just please write them down here, and thank you for watching.